When Florida first announced it was recruiting an army to hunt down one of the most dangerous invasive species on the planet, the internet did what the internet always does. It laughed. Late-night hosts joked about it. Twitter turned it into a meme. Comment sections filled up with jabs about the Florida man stereotype, as if the whole plan was just another headline destined to end in chaos. But behind the punchlines was a serious, carefully engineered war being fought in the swamps of South Florida, a war against a predator so successful, so adaptable, and so destructive that it had already wiped out nearly all the small mammals in one of the most iconic ecosystems on Earth. And the creatures Florida deployed to fight back weren't a joke at all. They were the result of years of science, trial, error, and desperation. This is the real story of how Florida tried to fix a mistake that started decades ago, and why the truth behind the plan is far stranger and far more effective than anyone expected. To understand why Florida had to take such drastic action, you have to go back to the beginning, to a mistake that started small and grew into an ecological catastrophe. In the 1970s, the exotic pet trade discovered a new star attraction, the Burmese python. Native to the swamps, grasslands, and forests of Southeast Asia, these snakes were sold to American pet owners as fascinating, low-maintenance companions. What the pet stores didn't always mention was that a cute 2-foot hatchling could grow into an 18-foot, 200-pound apex predator capable of swallowing a deer whole. Thousands of people bought pythons without understanding what they were signing up for, and as the snakes grew too large, too expensive to feed, and too dangerous to keep in a suburban home, many owners did the unthinkable. They opened a door, drove to the edge of the Everglades, and let the snake go. The Everglades, it turned out, was practically designed for a creature like the Burmese python. Warm, humid, thick with cover, and packed with prey that had never evolved any defense against an ambush predator of this size, the wetlands became a paradise for the escaped snakes. Then, in 1992, nature delivered a devastating assist. Hurricane Andrew tore through South Florida with catastrophic force, destroying homes, businesses, and, critically, a python breeding facility near the edge of the Everglades. Hundreds of captive pythons were released into the wild in a single storm, dramatically accelerating a population that was already establishing itself. By the time wildlife officials fully grasped what was happening, the pythons were no longer a fringe problem. They were an entrenched, breeding, spreading crisis. The scale of the damage that followed is difficult to overstate. Female Burmese pythons can lay between 50 and 100 eggs in a single clutch once a year, and they can live for more than 2 decades. With no natural predators in Florida besides the occasional large alligator, the population exploded largely unchecked for years. Researchers eventually conducted a study that became one of the most alarming data points in the entire crisis. Scientists released marsh rabbits fitted with tracking collars into areas of the Everglades known to have pythons, simply to see what would happen to the local prey base. Within 11 months, pythons were responsible for the deaths of 77% of those rabbits. It was staggering proof that the snakes weren't just present in the ecosystem, they were dominating it. Broader surveys told an even darker story. Raccoon and opossum populations had dropped by more than 90% in python-heavy areas, and bobcats, foxes, and marsh rabbits had become exceptionally rare or vanished entirely from some regions. The python hadn't just moved into the Everglades. It had rewritten the food chain. For years, the state's response was slow, scattered, and largely dependent on the efforts of a small number of dedicated volunteers. Independent hunters would head out into the swamp on their own time, using flashlights and machetes, hoping to spot the telltale giraffe-patterned skin hidden among the sawgrass. It was grueling, thankless work, and even the most skilled hunters were only capturing pythons in the low hundreds over the course of years. Burmese pythons are, by nature, almost impossible to see. Their coloring blends seamlessly into the marsh. They can remain motionless for hours, and they spend much of their time submerged or tucked beneath dense vegetation. Wildlife biologists eventually calculated that a person walking through known python habitat had less than a 1% chance of spotting one, even when the snake was right there. Something bigger than a handful of volunteers with flashlights was going to be needed. That's when Florida decided to escalate, and this is where the story starts sounding like something out of a science fiction plot rather than a wildlife management program. In 2017, The South Florida Water Management District and the state's Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission launched formal removal programs, hiring dozens of contracted hunters and paying them not just a flat fee, but bonuses tied to the length of the snakes they brought in, since larger pythons represent more breeding potential removed from the wild. The state also opened the door to the public, allowing any Florida resident to legally hunt and euthanize pythons on designated public lands without a license, and even on private land with the owner's permission. It even created the now famous Python Challenge, an annual event that turns snake hunting into a public competition, complete with cash prizes for the most pythons caught and the largest one captured. What had once been a quiet, unofficial fight became a statewide mobilization. But the real innovation, the piece of the story that made people initially scoff and then eventually fall silent in astonishment, involved using the python's own biology against them. Researchers realized that during breeding season, male Burmese pythons don't sit still. They travel remarkable distances, sometimes many miles, actively searching for females ready to mate. So scientists began surgically implanting radio and GPS transmitters into captured male pythons, and then releasing them back into the wild. These snakes earned a chilling nickname among researchers, Judas snakes, a reference to the biblical betrayer, because every male fitted with a tracker would eventually lead hunters directly to a breeding aggregation, often revealing multiple females and, more importantly, their nests. One tracked male in a well-documented case led researchers to a single female that turned out to be carrying nearly 122 eggs, an entire future generation of pythons eliminated in one intervention instead of being left to hatch and disperse across the Everglades. It was strange, it was slightly unsettling, and it worked far better than almost anyone expected. Detector dogs became another unlikely hero of the campaign. Handlers began training scent dogs, breeds like Labrador retrievers, to recognize the distinctive odor of python scent trails and, in some cases, python eggs buried in nests. Unlike human hunters who rely almost entirely on eyesight in an environment that seems built to hide its predators, dogs process the world through smell, and a trained detection dog can pick up a python scent trail in dense brush where a person would walk right past it. Early trials showed detection dogs locating pythons at a noticeably higher rate than human searchers covering the same ground, especially in finding nests tucked deep into vegetation that would otherwise go completely unnoticed until the eggs hatched. None of this, it's worth being honest, has solved the problem outright, and this is where the story becomes less about triumph and more about a long, grinding campaign of containment. Wildlife officials still cannot say with any precision how many pythons remain in the Everglades. Because of how difficult the snakes are to detect, estimates have ranged from the tens of thousands to numbers some researchers believe could be far higher when you account for the snake's reproductive output over more than 4 decades of unchecked breeding. What officials can point to is measurable, real progress. In 2025, Florida's combined removal programs pulled an unprecedented number of pythons from the wild, a record year that state officials credited directly to the combination of GPS-tracked Judas snakes, detection dogs, expanded public hunting access, and significantly increased bounties for contracted hunters. Governor Ron DeSantis publicly highlighted the pay increases for python removal agents, noting that hunters were now earning substantially more per snake than in previous years, a financial incentive designed to keep skilled trackers in the field for longer stretches. There's also an economic postscript to this story that surprised almost everyone who followed it. Rather than simply disposing of the thousands of pythons removed each year, some of the captured snakes have been processed into leather. A company called Inversa began turning removed python skins into wallets, boots, and even footballs, an attempt to create a market-driven incentive that funds further removal efforts while putting a byproduct of an ecological disaster to some practical use. It's an unusual full-circle moment. An invasive species that decimated native wildlife populations is now, in a very small way, funding its own removal. And yet, even amid all this progress, scientists uncovered something else lurking inside the pythons themselves, something that reveals just how deep and complicated this invasion truly runs. Burmese pythons, it turns out, didn't just bring their bodies to Florida. They brought a parasite with them. Raelietiella orientalis, a lung-dwelling pentastome native to the snake's original range in Southeast Asia, has been steadily spreading from python to native Florida snake species. Unlike the pythons themselves, which evolved alongside this parasite and can tolerate it, native snakes have no evolutionary defense against it, and infections can prove lethal. Researchers have now confirmed the parasite has spread to more than 30 Florida counties, infecting native species that had nothing to do with the original invasion and are now paying a price for it anyway. It's a sobering reminder that an invasive species rarely brings just one problem. It brings an entire hidden ecosystem of consequences that can ripple outward for years before anyone notices. So when people mocked Florida for its strange, high-tech, seemingly absurd war on pythons, GPS-tagged traitor snakes leading hunters to their own mates, dogs sniffing out eggs in the swamp, bounty hunters competing in an annual reptile championship, they were laughing at a response to a crisis most of them didn't fully understand. This wasn't a state overreacting to a minor nuisance. This was an ecosystem in genuine crisis, one where native mammal populations had collapsed by staggering percentages, where an apex predator with no natural enemies had been breeding unchecked for over 40 years, and where scientists had to get creative, sometimes strangely creative, because conventional methods simply weren't fast enough to keep pace with a threat this large. The truth isn't that Florida did something ridiculous. The truth is that Florida was forced to fight biology with biology, technology with technology. And in 2025, for the first time in years, the numbers finally started tilting, even slightly, in the right direction. The war in the Everglades is far from over. Officials are candid about the fact that total eradication of the Burmese python from South Florida is likely impossible at this point. The population is too established, the terrain too vast, and the snake too well adapted to its adopted home. What's realistic, and what the state is now aiming for, is long-term suppression, keeping numbers low enough that native wildlife has a chance to recover and stabilize, even if the python can never be fully erased from the landscape. It's not the clean, triumphant ending that headlines might promise, but it is a real, measurable shift after decades of watching the crisis spiral with no answer in sight. What makes this story worth telling isn't just the strange details, the traitor snakes, the trained dogs, the reptile hunting competitions with cash prizes. It's the reminder of how expensive and difficult it is to undo a small, careless decision made decades earlier by people who had no idea what they were unleashing. A handful of pet owners deciding a snake had grown too big to keep triggered a chain of consequences that, 40 years later, required government agencies, university researchers, surgical implants, trained detection animals, and millions of dollars to even begin to contain. The Everglades will likely carry the scars of the Burmese python invasion for generations, a permanent reminder written into its food chain of how much damage one released animal can do when it lands somewhere with no natural checks against it. So the next time you see a headline that sounds too strange to be true, a state deploying an army of engineered trackers, trained animals, and betraying snakes into a swamp, it might be worth pausing before you laugh. Sometimes the strangest sounding plan is the only one desperate enough and clever enough to actually work. Florida didn't win the war against the python, but for the first time in a long time, it's no longer clearly losing it either. What do you think? Should more states be willing to try unconventional, even strange-sounding solutions when facing an invasive species crisis, or does this kind of intervention carry risks we haven't fully considered yet? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you found this story as wild as we did, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories hiding behind the headlines.